It is so good to be here with everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. Thank you to our guests. Welcome to the Wikimedia Foundation's first live conversation on sustainability and climate. I'm excited to kick off what I hope to be the first of many conversations on this topic. Climate change is one of the most pressing issues that we face today. And it feels somewhat surreal to make that statement right now in the midst of a global pandemic. But if we look not just over the course of the next 12 months, but into the next 12 years, over the course of multiple generations, we know that the work that we do today on addressing climate resilience and sustainability is the work that really defines and shapes our futures. Even as we're sitting in the midst of this unprecedented pandemic, we have continued to see climate disasters all over the world. Record-breaking forest fires in Australia and the west coast of the United States, massive floods in Southeast Asia and in China, and intense tropical storms that continue to batter Central America and the Caribbean. The need to take action is as urgent as it has ever been. This is an opportunity, of course, and a responsibility for all of us. But in our unique capacity as Wikimedians, what we're looking at today is the conversation that we can have and the role that we can play on awareness and public knowledge about the climate crisis through our projects. We know that the Wikimedia projects fundamentally shape how people understand the world around them. And we are in a unique role to bridge that gap between climate science, the decades of research and data, numerous studies about how our world is changing and humans' role within that, and public understanding about climate change and how to take action. I also want to acknowledge that many groups across our movement are already doing this work. And in fact, many within the movement have been in the forefront of pushing this agenda as part of our global conversation. For example, last week, Future Climate for Africa and the Climate Development Knowledge Network concluded the Wiki for Climate Editathon, which was focused on welcoming more climate change experts as contributors into the Wikimedia projects. Nearly 100 participants improved hundreds of articles around information about some of the most impacted communities in Africa and around the world. In the last year, English Wikipedia's core climate articles have seen over 98 million page views. This is a start, but let's be honest, we can do a lot more. It's not simply about making sure that everyone has access to information about climate change. As a global movement, we have the opportunity to expand the understanding of climate science and climate impacts beyond what are dominant narratives in North America and Europe. Through our projects, we can have the opportunity to ask questions about which voices are telling the story of our climate crisis. Where are we getting our information, and what voices and communities have been left out? This is why the Wiki for Climate Editathon has been so powerful, to see African climate African climate experts editing on the impact of climate change for Africa. These are the sort of projects that we want to continue to see. Today, I am thrilled to announce our guests, and I'm about to hand it over to them because I know that they are who you are here to see, to speak more about climate change, climate justice, and the women who are leading the way on these issues. I am really excited to introduce you to a dear friend of mine for the past decade. Dr. Ayanna Johnson is a marine biologist who has dedicated her work to bringing more awareness around climate change into the general public, as well as awareness about what each of us can do in face of this crisis, which can at times be overwhelming. The thing that I admire the most about Dr. Johnson, in addition to everything, as a close friend and an inspiration in my work, I think, as well, is her unique ability to take really difficult topics and make them accessible, understandable, tangible, and actionable for the public. She has taken climate and turned it not into something that is terrifying and frightening, but something that is empowering and uplifting, where all of us have a role to play. And she has used her platform and her persuasiveness to be able to elevate other leaders and other voices on these critical issues. I know that I am inspired every day to take action on this by Dr. Johnson's work, and I hope you will be too. In her latest book, All We Can Save, she documents the women climate leaders who are bringing more awareness to the local impacts of climate change, not just the local impacts, but also the actions that we can take and the ways in which we can and should have hope for a future that we can not just save, but build together. We have several copies of this book available for staff, and Lydia will share more details after the talk. Dr. Johnson will be interviewed by our own Rosie Stevenson Goodnight. Of course, many of you already know Rosie. Rosie is a prolific editor on English Wikipedia. She is the co-founder of Wiki Project Women and Women in Red, two groups that are dedicated to improving the representation of women on Wikipedia. Over the last several years, Rosie and Women in Red have written thousands of meticulously sourced articles, making a significant impact on the number of articles about women in the Wikimedia projects, as well as perception about the impact and need for us to address gender gaps across the knowledge ecosystem. Over to you, Rosie and Dr. Johnson. I am so excited for the conversation you're about to have today. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you very much for that handoff, Catherine. And it's such a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Johnson.
Likewise.
Shall we go ahead and get started?
Let's do it. I have to say, I think that might be the first time that Catherine has called me Dr. Johnson. It was a little bit disconcerting as like a super dear old friend. And this is exciting to be like finding professional collaborations after many years of deep conversations about our individual work. So Rosie, with you, with Wikimedia more broadly, I think it's exciting to think about what we could build together in the longer term. So yeah, let's kick it off.
All right, so you start in the climate movement. You start with your advocacy for oceans and oceanography. Can you tell us a bit more about your work there?
Gosh, it's such a broad question. I think perhaps the thing that's like most useful by way of framing is that the way that I approach ocean issues, not necessarily the specific work that I do, has always been how can science be used to inform policymaking, and what does it look like to care for coastal communities, coastal cultures, coastal economies, and so how can science help us figure that out? And then of course, all that is happening within the context of a changing climate. And so I worked for many years in the Caribbean on ocean policy with island governments and fishing communities. My work on oceans now has to do more with the future of coastal cities in the US in particular. I've co-founded a policy think tank called the Urban Ocean Lab, which brings together science and policy and design and justice to try to figure out like, what is the future of coastal cities, given the impacts of climate change, given just how much we need to transform the ways in which we live on the edges of continents.
That's yours.
Yeah. So that's, I guess, a little bit about my ocean work. It's really driven by a commitment to people, as opposed to a pure curiosity in science. Because, I mean, I decided I wanted to be a marine biologist when I was 5. Many kids have this same dream. I learned to swim. I went to Key West, Florida. I rode on a glass bottom boat, and I was just like, there's a whole other world under there. And I have so many questions, and this seems amazing. And what are all these aliens? And can this be my job? But I don't think that would have held my attention, just like it doesn't for so many kids for a wide variety of reasons. Either people are told that it's not something that's really open to them. They don't see themselves in the work. But for me, it was like the science is only part of the puzzle. When I figured out that I could be actually, have all my dream jobs at once. So that was when I was 5. When I was 10, I wanted to be, this is so specific, I wanted to be the lawyer that got the next Martin Luther King out of jail. I was learning about the civil rights movement, and I was like, that seems like a good job, but then also you don't get killed. And then I wanted to be a park ranger once I started doing more backpacking, and I was like, getting paid to walk around the forest, obviously, best job. And then it was like environmental lawyer when I realized that like, we need to take these jerks to court who are ruining the planet. And so I actually see ocean conservation as all of those things at the same time, right? Like we need to understand the science. We also need to be changing policy. We need to be caring for the justice implications of the work, and protecting nature all at once. So that's, I guess, why I think of it as this crazy puzzle that we need to solve, and that's what keeps me sort of very interested. I'm not like a science all day, every day kind of girl. And I have huge respect for people who are, and I read their papers and try to help make sure that they're used for good decision making.
You mentioned Ocean Lab a minute ago. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that does?
Sure. So Urban Ocean Lab is a policy think tank, and it evolved out of sort of a moment of self-assessment and reflection about like what am I good at? What is the work that needs doing, and what would actually bring me some joy? Which is, I think, a Venn diagram that's open to all of us, because there is, in fact, so much work that needs doing. And so this intersection of my expertise on ocean and climate and policy issues, my passion for design and justice, and as a Brooklyn native, and seeing all those things intersect, was what led to the creation of this nonprofit policy think tank, because we just don't have a good plan for the future of coastal cities, given sea level rise, given more extreme weather events, heat waves, hurricanes. We need to shift our infrastructure. We need to shift how we think about coastal ecosystems. We need to adapt to sea level rise, right? We can't build a wall around everything and keep the entire ocean back. Like we just cannot hold back the entire ocean. I mean, New York City alone has 578 miles of coastline. So we're going to need some different options. And a lot of that has to do certainly with policy and with how we manage the transition, I guess I would say, as people start to move, as we start to help people move out of harm's way.
So you recently edited a book, All We Can Save. What is that about? And how did you find the women, and what made you choose the ones that you did include?
Yeah, so this is what the book looks like. And my favorite part of the book maybe is, well, that's too hard to choose actually, but the back of the book I think is notable because it lists all the contributors. Instead of blurbs from famous people, we want these people to be famous. This is, we think, a representative of the collection of voices that we need to address the challenge that we are facing. And so there are, it's an anthology of essays by 41 women climate leaders, along with also around 16 poems and original illustrations, to really offer as many different ways as possible to understand and consider not just the challenge that we're facing, but all the solutions that we have on hand. And so the subtitle for the book is Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And for me, that is really like the trifecta for how we approach this, right? Like truth is in many ways the scientific piece. Like, what do we actually know? What information are we using to make decisions? We can't shy away from the truth, no matter how dire it may be, in terms of what kinds of futures are projected. And that's why courage comes in, right? Like we have to bravely face what is possible, like what realities are presenting themselves to us, especially given sort of the headwinds we're against often in terms of politics and corporate influence, for example, and cultural norms that need to shift, and then solutions, because we don't talk nearly enough about the fact that we basically have all the solutions we need. We have them. We just need to implement them at scale. And I often prefer the word replicate instead of scale, because it's not about like this mega one thing. It's about like solutions everywhere. It's about agriculture and buildings and transportation and electricity and land use and conservation. All of these things go into it. And we know how to do this stuff. And I think that's the story we need to tell and share more often. So I would love to see more of a focus within the work of Wikipedia's contributions, a focus on these solutions, right? Like, because it can feel so overwhelming to just have ever more detailed explanations of the problem. And then you're like, what now? And we actually know the answer to the what now, right? We know that it is regenerative farming. We know that it is electrifying our energy grid. We know that it is better public transportation and electrifying that. We know that, like, in the US, buildings are responsible for 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. We don't talk about that nearly enough, like insulating our attics, right? Like is not, it's not a small thing. So I think the more we can talk about the full spectrum of what's possible, the more people we can welcome in to this work, the more people who will see themselves in it, right? So this book, was supposed to be 20 essays. It is 41 essays because we could not stop but ourselves from bringing in more and more perspectives and areas of expertise, right? There's our essays by farmers who are shifting the way they do agriculture so that the soil absorbs more carbon. An ocean farmer who's thinking about how do we regeneratively farm the ocean with seaweed and shellfish in a way that is a part of our climate solutions. From a supermodel who is reforming the fashion industry from the inside, from policy experts and NASA climate scientists and soil scientists and architects and artists, right? Because it takes all of these things, because we have to essentially transform the way we do pretty much everything. And so that was part of the vision of the book, was to show all these, essentially all these, each essay is like a door into the climate work that needs doing. So this is 41 doors, and we hope that everyone who reads it will see themselves in there somewhere, see like, oh, my uncle would really like that idea. My best friend would really vibe around like this solution and this area of opportunity, or this story of what this organization did. And it's all women, because those are the voices we weren't hearing enough, as you are very familiar, right? Like when Catherine shared with me how small the percentage was of biography pages on women, I was horrified. What is the current percentage? How is it going?
It's improving every day, but we're still under 19% of biographies on English Wikipedia being about women. There's been a significant increase, but it's still relatively small, being less than 19%.
Yeah. And, women are more than 19% of the US population.
You mentioned the 41 different chapters, 41 different voices in this book, and some of the messages, truth and courage and solutions. I wonder about the youth who are going to be reading your book.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about them as climate leaders? What are they going to learn from reviewing this book, and how will they see themselves, and what will inspire them? Do you have thoughts about the youth?
I guess first I would say there are 2 youth climate leaders who wrote essays for the book. The first essay in the book is actually written by Shea Bastida, who is a 17-year-old, maybe she's 18 now, youth climate activist. She just started college this fall. And she has been one of the leaders of the youth climate movement in New York City. She is truly remarkable and writes an essay on climate justice and like, what does it mean to be a climate justice activist? And she ends her essay with this wonderful insight, which I will paraphrase probably badly, but the climate movement succeeds I'm just going to read it. Why would you botch someone else's words when you can just, do them justice? A vibrant, fair, and regenerative future is possible, not when thousands of people do climate justice activism perfectly, but when millions of people do the best they can, which is just like such a good vibe to bring to this work, right? Like we are obsessed with being perfect individuals as opposed to being a part of a massive transformation of the way that we live on this planet. So between her and the other youth activist in the book, they really do offer insights into how they have shaped their work, collective work, and I think one of my hopes is that young people who read this book will start to see how many ways there are to shape their careers, their current interests, and have that be a significant contribution to climate work, right? Like if you are interested in farming or art or fashion or policy or law or activism, like I hope that young people who read this will sort of see how climate work fits with the things that they are already passionate about, which maybe they hadn't considered as sort of a climate career. And I would say the same thing is true of sort of like how we sort of curate and share knowledge too, the way that that Wikipedia is structured and evolves, I think is an interesting parallel for that, right? Like there are all these different ways to contribute and highlight the different facets of the work that's being done and the work that needs doing.
So I'd like to touch more on that. The 41 women who are in your book, we can, in the greater Wiki movement, take a look at them and see about following their careers and do they meet the notability requirements to be to have an article, a biography on Wikipedia. But I am sure that there are women out there who are not getting the coverage, that the media isn't covering them, that they don't get in the textbooks, they don't get in the history books, they aren't a part of an anthology. I'm wondering, how can we in the greater Wikimedia movement find these women? Where should we be looking for them? How can we spotlight them in the same way that you've been doing what you're doing? How can we bring more spotlights on more women in this general area of climate change and environment?
I have a really lame answer to that question, which is Twitter, which is where I found most of these people. There is like a great community of people online there. I mean, there's some parts of Twitter which are like a hellscape, but women talking about climate is actually like a very lovely corner of Twitter. From their areas of expertise around science or policy, sharing articles by each other, it is like one of the best examples of shine theory, right? Like this idea that like when you shine, we all shine, that light reflects back. And that is, certainly the vibe of the book. And as we continue to build the nonprofit organization that we've co-founded, me and my co-editor of the anthology, Catherine Wilkinson, as we continue to build that work, we will be a part of what you're describing, which is like, how do we continue to surface more and more of the expertise of the women who are leading and whose insights we could all learn so much from. But the sort of short answer is like, I don't know. That is hard. That is a hard thing to do, right? To find all of the remarkable people worth highlighting and potentially creating pages for when we have, for example, a media that doesn't make these people notable or noteworthy, right? So I guess I would say part of it is collaborating with people who are doing, who are in the space, who can, help recommend others. now you're just making me think like I should be keeping a list.
I may circle back to you in later weeks and months on that.
Yeah, please do.
So, women leadership, though, in the climate and environmental space seems to have driven much of the recent global movement, people like you and Greta Thunberg. So, what do you think are the many public and visible women leading the climate movement about? Why do you think now has sort of become your time, their time?
Well, the status quo just clearly wasn't working, right?
Right.
We just simply didn't have the leadership we needed. We have leaders, but as Dr. Wilkinson, my co-editor, put so perfectly, the climate crisis is a leadership crisis, right? If we had the leaders we needed, we wouldn't be in this mess, or we'd be in like a different version of this mess. And it's not about replacing the small group of white men who have been leading this work. It is about building a larger collective of leaders so that we are representing the spectrum of work that needs doing, the spectrum of communities, which is all communities who need to be engaged in this transformation. I like to think of it as like we need climate leaders everywhere because we need to adapt to and mitigate climate everywhere. And as Catherine, too many Catherines in my life, as Dr. Wilkinson and I sort of did our research in writing the introduction for the book and looked into the social science, it became very clear how critical gender equality was to getting this right on solutions, because we found, for example, that there's strong evidence that that women legislators more strongly support environmental laws and stricter laws, that when parliaments have greater representation of women, they're more likely to ratify environmental treaties. When women are equal participants with men, climate policy interventions are more effective. Higher political and social status for women correlates with lower carbon emissions and greater creation of protected areas. These are quantitative benefits of gender equality in climate decision making. So if we try to pretend that who decides doesn't matter, then we are closing our eyes to the realities that say like it absolutely matters who is making these decisions and who's controlling the dollars and who is influencing policy. But I think when we think about the question of women in the climate movement in general, and you brought up Greta Thunberg, when I think about her, my first thought always goes to, there's a version of the world in which she is still sitting alone outside the Swedish parliament because no one else joined. And that's the beautiful thing about the climate movement, is that a lot of other, mostly teenage girls were like, I'm in. I'm doing this in my town. I'm doing this in my school. I'm doing this in front of the UN. Like, I'm with you. And I think that realization that like, that sort of, this is cheesy, but like we are the ones we've been waiting for. It's certainly true for Wikipedia as well, right? Like if you don't edit the page, it may well not get edited, right? If you don't create the biographies for the leaders that we should be following, like they will simply not exist. And the sort of like the few things that we really sort of pulled out, the themes around gender, was that we see there's like a few important characteristics in women's leadership in the climate movement. And we sort of see this as something that we're documenting and encouraging and not like inventing, right? We are witnessing what we call a feminist climate renaissance. It is happening. It's a matter of like, do we support it? Do we enable it to flourish, or do we allow it to be squashed? And so what we see is that there's, I'm like referring to the book as I look sort of like off to the left here. There's a clear focus on making change rather than being in charge, which is key, right? It's like, how are we going to get this thing done? Second, there's this commitment to responding to the climate crisis in ways that heal systemic injustices rather than deepen them. It's this really deep commitment to making sure that our climate solutions actually work for everyone. And the third is that there's this appreciation for heart-centered, not just head-centered leadership, right? This is not a purely technical problem. This is a problem that requires us to bring our whole selves to this work. And last, what we see is that there's this recognition that building community is a requisite foundation for building a better world. This focus on the collective rather than the individual. And of course, these leadership characteristics, these approaches to the work are open to people of any gender. We're just seeing this emerge in droves among the women who are at the forefront of this work. And so we want to sort of encourage everyone to jump in there with us.
That's inspiring. Let's shift the focus to,
Sure.
to geography. Wikipedia, as you probably know, is a very international community. But we tend to see a bias in editors, in content, perhaps in readers towards Europe and North America. And I wonder, what does that look like in the climate movement and the communities that you work with? How does it affect who we promote in high profile communications? Again, in media, in the history books, in the textbooks.
So I have a not very useful answer to this question, because I have deliberately chosen to focus my work on the United States. And that is because the US is the largest cumulative contributor to the climate crisis in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions over this nation's history. And we've done the least to fix it, arguably, relative to the devastation we have caused. And so I focus on how do we transform the landscape of climate work in the United States, because that will affect people everywhere. And to the extent that we can be a leader instead of a laggard in the international community, that will make a really big difference. And so we chose to focus the book on all women living and working in the US, because we wanted to talk to an American audience and basically like, get it together, America. Like, we really need you to get it together. And like, here are all these beautiful examples of like what getting it together looks like. And so I will admit to being like woefully underinformed about the critical climate work that I am absolutely sure is happening around the world, led by women and all sorts of folks, right? So I think I am not good at answering this particular question, because after many years working in the Caribbean, I made a conscious decision to like go home and try to fix the place I'm from. Instead of being a person who's like going to other countries and telling them what to do. And I think that is certainly not mutually exclusive with highlighting the work that others are doing in other places. So as my work continues and evolves, it's certainly something I would like to bring in more and more, is in particular, like with the Urban Ocean Lab, right? Like, there are coastal cities all over the world that have lessons to teach us for how we can adapt to climate change in the US. So highlighting the work of all of those experts around the world will be a big part of what we're doing in creating case studies for what it looks like to get it right for coastal cities. And I'm not exactly sure how that will play out with the All We Can Save project. Because you need to limit your scope somehow in order to maximize your effectiveness, and geography is a handy way to do that. So your question is just raising a lot of questions for me about how I approach my work and how I might be a better sort of global citizen in the way that I do that.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very thoughtful And I hope you do give it some consideration and maybe circle back with us. Love to hear more from you. Now I want to focus on the Wikipedians who are either on this call or who will listen to this later, and the journalists, the media, who are either here now or will be listening to this at a later time. Do you have ideas on how we, in Wikipedia spaces, in journalism spaces, and in all the different forms of media, how we can better communicate what women are doing in the climate movement? Climate news and communication, as we know, is starting to recover from a drop in attention because of the pandemic. We're starting to see some more headlines. So I wonder, what do you think will be different about telling the action story? And what kind of topics do you think Wikipedia and Wikipedians should be focusing on in this change?
I guess I would say like the last few years in the US in particular, but also in the global conversation with the Women's March, with the Me Too movement, with the movement for Black Lives, have made it very clear to journalists that they need to shift who they're interviewing in order to be considered to have a legitimate spectrum of sources for a story, which has led to my inbox being an absolute disaster tornado of requests for interviews, because people are like, oh, Black woman scientist all in one person, like, let's all interview Ayana. And so a lot of my emails are like, I don't have time, but go talk to this person. And I think, sort of making sure we, to the extent that we have the capacity doing that, like when we can't do it, passing the mic to others who we know have valuable things to say is a very easy way to contribute to that. But I guess there's also a role to for those who who have the time and just shouldn't be talking anymore, right? There are people who we've been listening to for so long that it's time for them to pass the mic. And Bill McKibben, for example, does a really good job of this in his column in the New Yorker, which is actually an interesting place to look for leaders and content ideas for Wikipedia, because he has a pass the mic section where he highlights the work of a different person every week. And does a short interview with them or shares about their work. And I always find that to be really an interesting way to learn about other things that are happening. I guess. So because journalism is now being held to a higher standard as regards like the diversity of the people that they're interviewing as experts and quoting, I think going through some of these press articles and looking at who is being cited and quoted is actually like a good place to look for more and more people who are sort of emerging as voices in the space. And I think we just need a better mix of, it's gonna sound like a weird one maybe, but like a better mix of timelines on which we do journalism and create media, right? Because like when we are always in a rush, we go to the same people and we hear the same voices. And when we take the time to do a longer time frame of research for a story, or have an evolving project such as Wikipedia, that's what gives us the opportunity to deliberately seek out new voices. And so I think for like the quick turnaround, like news of the day stories, it can be harder because they want an answer within an hour and they want to get on the phone with you that afternoon and they need a quote for their piece to run in the morning, right? And often what you see in situations like that is that women and people of color do not have the bandwidth to respond to these demands on that timeline. We notice that even with curating the book. It is often like the white women who had the support networks that would enable them to meet their deadlines. They had assistants. They had people who could help them put their notes into sentences to create the first draft. They had people to care for the children. They had more resources to bring to bear so that they could contribute more fully with their expertise because they weren't also burdened with all of these other things. Whereas the women of color in the book were managing so many other things at once without any help, that for them meeting the deadlines for creating an essay was often much more of a challenge. And so just acknowledging that the timelines on which we do projects determines who gets included, I think is a valuable lesson that I've learned in the last year for sure.
I think that probably would be true with Wikipedians reaching out to experts such as you and others, and asking them for their opinions or encouraging them to edit. And I have it on good authority that you had a great experience editing Wikipedia as part of an event with the Smithsonian a few weeks. So I want to ask you about your podcast, but first let me ask, did you keep on editing after that?
I didn't, and I feel a little bit bad about it. It was a totally delightful experience. We had Dr. Nancy Knowlton, who was the ocean chair at the Smithsonian Institution at the time. She's now retired. She was a professor at my graduate school. Actually, her husband was my PhD advisor. She's an absolute phenom. She created something called the Ocean Portal on the Smithsonian's website that has a lot of evergreen content about ocean science topics. And I had, at the time, was executive director of an operating foundation called the Waite Institute. And I was building all these fact sheets to inform people about whether it was like conch or lobster or coral reefs or ocean zoning or marine protected areas. So I was sort of like building my own versions of what could be considered content that would go on a Wikipedia page to share with the communities that I was working in, to make sure that they had, you know, as much of the information as they wanted that I had sort of in my brain from school. And so she and I got together for World Oceans Day and invited all of our colleagues. My job was to like offer up my conference room and a bunch of sandwiches. And we invited people in, and we had these amazing Wikimedians in the DC area, to where I was living at the time, who came and gave us all tips about how to edit and sort of like Wikipedia in general, and sort of hung out with us for the day as we each thought about like, how do we either create or add to these various pages. And it was a total blast. And I do intend to jump back in there at some point. And it was actually like quite shocking when I realized that there was a page about me, because that was a bit overwhelming. I was like, I don't know, some of this information, it doesn't feel quite right. I'm like, this makes me nervous. And now I'm sort of very glad to have it be like another way for people to learn about the work that I'm doing and the efforts that I'm a part of.
Dr. Johnson, I could keep asking you questions or for another hour, but I'll ask our moderator, how are we doing with time? And are there questions maybe from the audience that we want to ask right now, or shall I just keep asking questions?
Yeah, we've got like 6 or so minutes left.
So right now, I don't think we have any questions in queue and Zoom. Deb, you seeing anything in YouTube?
Nothing there.
All right.
So maybe, Rosie, we can keep going until someone pops in with a question.
Sounds great. I want to ask you about your podcast, Dr. Johnson.
Oh.
So you have a podcast, and it focuses on actionable, relevant information to a broad audience. So I'm thinking there's information that the audience otherwise isn't getting? How do you deal with the missing key information and decide what you're going to include in your podcast?
Yeah. So the podcast is called How to Save a Planet, and it's a total blast to make. I'm making it with a bunch of like audio nerds who are really good at making podcasts, and rein me in when I just try to like yell facts into the microphone for 40 minutes straight. So it actually is like a storytelling about climate as opposed to just information. And it has actually the same motivation as All We Can Save, the anthology, which is let's talk about the solutions. Like, let's talk about what we're going to do about it, which is sort of an answer to one of the questions you got at before, which is like, which is, you know, what I would really love to see more of in journalism, on Wikipedia, is like helping people move from like, oh my gosh, this is so bad, to, oh, I see how I could be part of fixing this. And so the show, as far as how we choose our topics, it's really hard because there are so many things to cover. So far, we've done episodes on offshore wind energy, on nuclear energy, which was like a pretty feisty bunch of feedback around that. People tend to have quite strong opinions about nuclear. I can only imagine what the Wikipedia pages on nuclear energy look like in terms of like the editing history. We have done one on Black Lives Matter and how that intersects with climate work. On the Green New Deal, on how that played out in Europe, on how 2020 became a climate election, on how to talk about climate, how to have these conversations with members of your close family who might be climate science deniers.
How about misinformation and disinformation? Have you touched on that?
We haven't done a full episode on that yet. It's certainly in the queue. We have some on regenerative farming, on recycling, on finance, all queued up. And we do actually, this might be useful for some folks. We do have like fairly extensive show notes for each episode. In our newsletter, we list more and more resources so that people can become as deeply informed as they want to. So if you can just listen to the show, you can read the reports and articles that went into our reporting, and you can look into the organizations behind that. So to the extent that it's useful for editing and augmenting what's presented on Wikipedia, we would love for folks to look at the show notes and see if there are resources in there that might help update some of the pages, or, you know, some of the episodes themselves might be worth referencing, because what we do is really interview experts, and often women and often people of color. So that's a good place to look also for more voices to highlight.
Rosie, sorry to interrupt. It looks like we do have one question in queue, if I can jump in with that. So Cassie asked, Dr. Johnson, what is something you wish people asked you more about, perhaps in relation to climate change?
So people often ask me, what can I do? And I wish more people asked me, what can we do, like together? Because I think it represents a totally different way of considering the challenge that we're facing, right? Like, we are thinking about this too much as individuals. How can I lower my individual carbon footprint? How can I just like be like the perfect individual when it comes to not impacting the climate? And I often get the question like, what's the one thing I can do to help? And it's just like, it's not about I, it's about we, and it's not about one thing. It's about changing the systems and figuring out how we can each make our most meaningful contribution to that transformation. And so maybe this is like a weird jujitsu of your question, Cassidy, but that's kind of like, that's what I wish that people were asking more about, was how to be a part of the collective shift, the cultural shift, as opposed to like, what can I do? And even worse, like, what's the one small, easy thing I can do? Which is perhaps the most annoying question that I get asked and every day.
And it looks
Because
like
if it
we
were
have,
that easy, you know, we might have done it.
right. We have another question for you, a fan of your podcast. They say, do you have any advice to the Wikimedia movement on how to think about storytelling? As stories are a great way to get the message across.
I guess here's where I admit sort of my partial naivete about the full spectrum of what Wikimedia is doing, which is obviously so much bigger than Wikipedia in terms of the curation of images and data and all these other things. So I think I would think beyond Wikipedia, certainly, in attempting to answer this question, because the way that climate change as a problem and the solutions to it have been portrayed are unsurprisingly like through often a very narrow sort of like white Western male lens, which certainly doesn't serve us. So to the extent that the data and the images that Wikimedia more broadly is curating reflect the global community that's doing this work, I think helping to change what we picture in our mind's eye when we think about the work that needs doing is a super valuable contribution. And also helping to think about, again, I'm sort of a broken record on this, but to the extent that Wikimedia can focus more on solutions than on the problems, or like equally on the solutions, I think could be really valuable. And there are stories certainly to be told there. But Catherine Marr, I'm certainly going to be like bothering you on the phone later to be like, okay, tell me remind me of all the different Wikimedia projects, and then I can like come up with better answers to this question, because I know there are so many different initiatives that are under this broader umbrella. But I can just answer this question maybe less specific to Wikimedia and more specific to what I see as a need in general on climate, which is we need to start talking about what the future looks like if we get it right. We need to help people understand why this is worth the effort. What future do we get to have? Because without that, you sort of lack motivation to do the work that's needed. And that work can be joyful, but it still is work. And so I think that would be really helpful to the extent that Wikimedia could be part of helping people understand what are we working towards, not just what are we working to prevent.
Thank you. It looks like we have another question on YouTube. I know that you, Dr. Johnson, you're going to have to drop shortly. Do you know if you can take one more?
Sure.
Okay, Deb, you want to go ahead with the YouTube question?
Yep, perfectly. We actually have two of them. So I'll give both of them if you can get both of them done. The first one was, are there any particular climate justice topics on which you'd like to see more women writing and creating? And then the second one, which might be shorter to talk about, that Dr. Johnson, your name has been mentioned as a potential NOAA administrator in the Biden administration. And the question was, would you say yes if asked, and what would you hope to accomplish?
The answer to the second question is no, I'm not interested in that position, although to see my name mentioned among these other luminaries was truly gobsmacking, very neat. And I'm certainly thinking about like ways in which I can contribute to the development of ocean climate policy from outside the administration. And as to the first question, like what climate justice issues would I like to see more women writing about? The answer is like I would quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, ironically perhaps, on this, who when asked, how many women is enough on the Supreme Court, and she said 9. So just more from women on all of it, I think, is where we're at right now. That's what's needed. So yeah, that's all I got.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Johnson and Dame Rosie, for today's conversation. As Catherine shared at the beginning of the talk, we have purchased some copies of Dr. Johnson's newest book, All We Can Save, and we're happy
It's
to
my
share.
only book.
Only
I
book.
appreciate you both thinking that there are multiple books, but this is the only one.
We're projecting there'll be more to come, I'm certain. So if you are interested in getting a copy of the book, I'm going to drop a link in the chat, the Zoom chat here. This is a link to a Google form that we have at the foundation to collect information if you'd like to receive a copy. Also on our Meta Talk page, we've shared that link as well. So again, Dr. Johnson, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending today.
My absolute pleasure, and I'll look forward to more collaborations with Wikimedia. Catherine, you're not getting away from me.
Oh no, we have so much more work to do. The work does not end. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Johnson.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, all.
Bye all.